This guy's been in Cambodia for a long time, been a great fixture of Phnom Penh life, Phnom Penh community. He's done one Nerd Night before. He's coming back for another one. Can we please have a huge round of applause for our final presenter tonight, John Weeks, talking about Cambodian comics.
Hello. Does anybody, it's going to be tough to top these earlier presentations, but I'll give it my best. Does anybody here like comics? No. Does anybody here like comics? Where are my sexy comics assistants? All right. Bernadette, you said it's important to own it. Let's own it. All right. Dina and Warren are going to hand out comics for y'all. Can we start the show? All right. Cambodian comics, subject near and dear to my heart. We have basically three main parts to Cambodian comics. We have the pre-revolutionary time. That's the Ramayana. This is the socialist 80s. And, oh, boom, next slide, Nerd Night. Get used to it. Pre-war time. That's Ut Ruin, first comic we know of, 1966. Chun Ra, hilarious stuff. And that's Holsopon. French influence time. People were able to make a living off doing comics. Amazing, amazing stuff. What happened? Well, the war happened. We only have a few existing artists that are still alive from that time. The drawing here is by Ung Bun Hien from his autobiography, his biography that was illustrated called The Murderous Revolution. We had no comics from 1975 to the 1980s. Comics we expected to start in 1966. This is a revolutionary propaganda comic by Ut Ruin called New Life in Kampong Preah. This guy's wearing his medal because he was fighting the good fight against the KR during that time. This is from 1986. What kickstarted the socialist era of comics was this fellow at Ruin, also who did an adaptation of the classic Cambodian bad boy story, Torn Chai, a little bad boy who upsets the king most of the time. And other people are just kind of like, hey, they're making money off of this. I ought to do some of this. I should totally do a comic. And people started doing comics. Here are some of the faces behind it. Ut Ruin survived the revolution, thank God, by drawing architectural plans. M. Satya, we'll see more of him. Oryutia, copied a lot of folks, does a lot of covers. Some of them are out there in the audience right now. Imso Ka, who does a lot of scary stuff, adaptations. Sinyang Param, romance, lots of romance. So all of them, okay, so this is Tum Tiu. It's the Cambodian Romeo and Juliet, many say. Very lovely adaptation by Ut Ruin. He has never allowed anybody to copy this work. This is an illegal screen printing copy. This is Romance of the Tiger Lady, Imso Ka, with a cover by Oryutia, and Savanasam, a magical wonder tale. Interesting thing, there's a lot of Indian film here in Cambodia in the 80s, so they include these musical interludes. This is a Kampong Tom is in the Heart. That's the musical break. Here's another musical comic based on a song, Sell Your Rice Field and Go to the Bar. Luik Sarai, Cho Bar. One of the hidden comics talents of Cambodia, Svai Ken. He retired from the Samaki Hotel, back when it was a socialist hotel. Now it's the Royale. You might know of it. You might have heard of it. He did painted stories in sequence about his wife's life, his life with his partner, and his friend Ingrid Muan. Hidden comics talent. This is the thoughts of Sinyang Param, one of the talents of that period. And she basically lived through the Khmer Rouge time, came out on the other side, did her romance comics. Then the market started to drop off from 1989 to 1993 and started to level down. They had sold most of their comics to middlemen. So overseas Cambodians, meanwhile, were doing their own thing. They were starting to, develop their own styles. This is Ung Bun Hien down below, and up there, Fusera Ing, starting to do his impressive work in Pazé Rouge. So the Murderous Revolution, you can get that at some of the photocopy shops here, unfortunately. Not many original copies here. So these are all outreach comics. Land is Light, Wrath of the Phantom Army, I Must Leave, The Trap of Sensuality, Land is Life, At the Factory Gates, Life's Choices, all didactic comics by NGOs. This is a third period of comics, and the most recent period, where comics are supported by nonprofits, and these are the artists of this period. Young people who've grown up in the post-revolutionary baby boom, and many of them work for doing these didactic comics, and they'll do comics for fun as well. We're starting to see comics are being supported by in an artistic sensibility. This is a French intervention that went from 2001 to 2004, mostly at Phare Pon Lu Salpak in Battambang. They put their comics online. There's some great stuff. They did a travel book, 7 months in Cambodia. They taught a lot of students about the traditional French way of doing things. And the great thing about the French is they're just kind of like, yeah, I do comics. They're not like, oh, it's so hard doing comics. Nobody appreciates me. So, of course, the French, once again, is coming in. They do a comics exhibition year 2004. Had a lot of fun with that. We had a speaker truck like they used to have for films. And in the speaker truck, it'd be like, comics exhibition, come and see it. Way to kind of get it out to the mass audience. Next year, Fuser Ing came out. That guy you'd seen earlier, one of the overseas Cambodians, came back. Was very interested in reconnecting with his roots. So he not only drew comics about Cambodia with a very sophisticated French-informed style, he also started teaching comics at the French Cultural Center, Phare Pon Lu Salpak. And we also had our first comics NGO, which I come to you from. It's called Our Books. And we published M. Satya. After the comics crash in the early 90s, he basically waited 17 years until he could finish Flower Battambang. And we launched it with an exhibition in the year 2007. That was a lot of fun to see. And there's a young community of Cambodian comics artists developing. Here they are linking up with the world on the 24-hour drawing day. If any of you guys want to join in, it's in October usually, and we welcome anybody to come and join and draw. There's been a women's comics workshop. We now have Cambodian comics webloggers. That's lovely to see. And there's more works. I'm out of time. But look, here's some products from Serra's teaching. This is Aki Ra, the guy who runs the Landmine Museum. Here's some stories, some new French comics that are out and are available at the French Cultural Center. So my time is up. Thank you so much. And you own it now.
Are there any questions for John? It looks like a lot of the comics are in either Khmer or French. Are there any in English?
Question for me?
Yeah. Yes. No, question for the... Let's ask the audience.
We do have comics in English. There's an interesting trend in the late 80s and early 90s of doing comics in English. And that was because I think things were loosening up a bit. And there's maybe 3 or 4 comics that are perennially reprinted. So one is Niang Rom Sai Sok, and there's one secret agent story, and but yeah, there's a few, but not many. Many nonprofit comics often have an English version as well, and we're starting to get into digital comics. Almost every comic that Our Books produces now has a digital version. We just finished converting Heritage Watch's Wrath of the Phantom Army into iPad and Mobi format for the Kindle.
Whoa, high tech. What's the process of coming up with a comic? Do you come up with the storyline first or the characters, or do you have a template that you just fill out?
Well, actually, that's a good point. The Anglophone world, they're a bunch of whiners. So they can be whiners sometimes. There's not a lot of money in comics. There's not a very strong career track for being a comic artist. It's starting to grow. It's starting to change a lot in the last, I'd say, 20 years or so. In France, we had the French people come out. I met them in 2001. I was so excited to meet the people who were teaching at Phare Pon Lu Salpak, and they're just kind of like theater people. They're like, oh yeah, it's my job. I have to scan these pages and get them to my editor. I love that. I envy that. I was like, I don't want to strangle them just because I was so envious. So the French, we have a lot to learn, and Cambodia has its own comics idioms. The fascinating thing is, if you look at M. Satya's work, you'll find that the ornamentation on the side of the panels is using the Cambodian kabak, or the ornamentation. So I think that there's a chance for Cambodia, being in between Japan and France, 2 very big comics cultures, to ideally take the best from both and hopefully not have too much imposed upon it.
Yes.
You mentioned a lot of adaptations. Are there a lot of, there's a lot of creative work as well?
Yes, people are making their own work, and there are graphic novels out there waiting to be printed. Actually, there's a story in the Phnom Penh, in the Cambodia Daily this last weekend about guy who was trafficked and basically drew a comic story to prove to his wife and everybody else in his village that he hadn't run away with another woman or anything, that he was actually trafficked on a fishing boat and was not having a good time with it. So people do comics for a lot of reasons. And there are adaptations. Some of the ones that are floating around in the audience are of movies. And people would sit in movie theaters and just try to capture the moment, more or less. I don't know exactly the process for doing these, but they look really sketchy. And some of these are quite old. So there's a whole world of comics in the 1980s that we're trying to recover and research, because many of these folks, they don't view themselves as comic artists, they view themselves as illustrators. So they will just melt into the background if there's not money to be made in comics. Right now, most of our comics in Cambodia are supported by NGO outreach reasons or by artistic reasons, for the most part. I would like to see some more supported by pure profit. That would be nice. That would be getting more towards a self-sustaining model.
When you said sketchy, was that pun intended?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I've just been wondering. Are there common themes in comics in Cambodia today?
Bong snai on snai bong. Romance, you're always safe with romance. I have to say, in the socialist time, they would do legend stories and they would do romance. They would occasionally try to do a contemporary story, but it was very easy in the 80s. It's like, okay, the Ministry of Information has to approve my comic. I had to just go for like a nice love story. It's really basic and simple. Or one of the classic legend stories. M. Satya, he drew about maybe a small number of comics, maybe 6 or 7 for all we know. But they were classics. They were like the legends that you really, really tell again and again. And then he sold them to middlemen. So after he finished a story and had printed his own print run, somebody would buy it up, and he would be competing against his own comics in the marketplace. That's kind of what caused the slump later on.
I have one final question from me. Oh, sorry. just like nerding out here. Okay, let's start with Corbett and then Dina. Oh, oops.
10 years old, I do the comic when I was 10 years old. This is my business. I have a bookshop, like have 400 or 1,000 comics, and I rent out. So my question is that how the comic influence the children in America? Are you American, right?
I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it. Interesting thing is, in Cambodia, we don't have superheroes. Why? What was that first slide we opened up with? The Ramayana. We had one of the Ramayana comics. You can't have, like, super Naga. I mean, a Naga is already kind of magical and super to begin with. So look at Hanuman. He can do pretty much anything. And not only that, he gets to sleep around. He doesn't like have to have like a clean reputation like Superman. There aren't like any little bastard super babies going around there. So yeah, I think getting back to your question, what was again about?
How does it affect American culture? American children.
American children. Well, interesting thing is there's not much difference between Cambodia and USA, in that it's the medium of comics is viewed as a medium for children or adults who are childish. So but we have seen comics that are created for adults. Like there's a story of Akira. There's the French comics that are about quite serious topics. There's that one Luc Srai Cholbar. That was a song for adults. We have like the wife at the end with a meat cleaver ready to chop her husband, and her husband is like lost all his clothes and gambling away. So there are adult comics in Cambodia, and I guess the thing is it depends on what you put into it for what you get out of it. What we're seeing with the teaching here is that people are very interested in telling their own stories. This young generation that we had like a shot of about 20 or so, they're very much interested in talking about their own lives, the lives they're living now, because it's a very interesting time to be living in a changing Cambodian society. So I hope that answers your question. We don't have a lot of commercial comics on the shelves that are available at a low price. I would love to see that change. We don't have comic shops in Cambodia. We have little stalls. We have bookstores that might have a comic here and there, but it's hit or miss. So I would love to see a comic shop like you had open again at some point.
One of the comic When I was 10 years old, most of the comic story that I read is about romantic, and also the adventurous, like the Rose Vance lady in the comics. So I mean, what kind of the story of the comic for American children like to read, and how it's influenced? Do the American children like to be brave, having adventurous, or do they like to drink or eat the fast food? I mean, how is how super size me or something?
We're seeing a lot more diversity in the Anglophone American comic market, which we're very happy to be away from here in Cambodia and exploring a different culture. So sometimes the large majority of American comics are superhero comics. There's actually a supervillain called Angkor. There's superheroes that are of Cambodian background, and their idea of diversification is affirmative action superheroes. So I'm not quite sure I buy that. I'm very happy to be here in Cambodia, and as for what kids are exploring right now, actually American children are very much into manga, which is quite interesting. So they're into a mix of things. It's diversifying slowly but surely. There's a lot of superheroes, but there is some more manga, and there are a lot more girls reading comics in America. But I'm here to talk about Cambodian comics. So if anybody has any more questions, then I will...
We have one more question from Corbett.
You sort of got it a little bit, so it's mostly... I'm curious about the age groups that are reading here. You mentioned like manga in America, and obviously manga, which is all age groups in Japan. But here, is it in gender as well? Boys or...
Can you get into the demographics of the readership a little bit more?
Demographics of the readership. Well, comics have been in use for outreach pretty much ever since UNTAC time. They've been used as didactic tools. I'm tracking down a comic right now about that was used for voting in the election. That was used to promote voting. In terms, kids seem to gobble up comics and seem to like them. We don't have a lot of we don't seem to have hard statistics, except from like very small print runs of comics that we have done specifically. But kids do seem to really like comics. And the fun part is, it's really like a gateway drug for reading. If you want to increase reading, Cambodia has a low literacy rate. It's one of the lowest literacy rates in mainland Southeast Asia. If you want to raise the literacy rate, give somebody a comic. That's a great way to get them started.
Great. Thank you very much, John Wiggs. Final round of applause.